Over the past couple of months, we have been in a sermon series that has been called Love in Action. The understanding is that we are a people who are loved by God, and we are called to be examples of that love, to share that love that is poured out on us. We are called to be loving as God's beloved. That is our calling. That is our place in life, is to show the world God's love. And so we've been asking, what does that love look like? How are we to be loving in a way that represents our God? Because the world has all kinds of definitions and understandings of what love looks like, and we want our love to be Christ-like. And so, of course, Jesus is the perfect example of what godly love looks like lived out in a human life. Because he is God in the flesh, the God who John proclaims God is love, took on flesh and dwelt among us, and his name is Jesus. And so we look to him for the ultimate example of that love. And over the course of this series, we've been looking at some of the stories in the Gospel of John that proclaim, that show us, these stories show us the Jesus being loving, and we see these examples of how he loves, and we want to love like that. We see a God who shows up out of his love. He shows up and he gets into our mess. He is there with us in the incarnation. We see a love that pays the price, that is willing to be sacrificial for the sake of others. We see a love that sees the barriers between people and tears them down, that isn't going to be hemmed in by cultural prejudices or expectations and wants to tear down those barriers to bring people together. We see a love that provides for the needs of others, both physically and spiritually. We see a love that stoops down to serve others. As Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, even as he prepares to go to a cross, he serves them, including his own betrayer. We see a love that abides, that stays connected to the vine and knows that that is where our love comes from. And last week, on Palm Sunday, we saw a love that chooses the cross over the crowd. That is, whatever the expectations of the crowd were as Jesus entered into Jerusalem amid shouts of Hosanna and waving of palm branches, he wasn't just there to do what they thought he should do. He was there to defy their expectations and go somewhere that they never would have thought for their sake. Because that was better, to pursue what they would have thought unfathomable. But that's the love that he has. A lot of movies that you see, you don't see it that much anymore because everything seems to have a sequel. But at the end of movies, a lot of times, just before the credits roll, you'll see kind of the script go across the screen that says, "The End," right? And we're accustomed to that. Once the end appears on the screen, or maybe at the end of the book, you see "The End" and the credits roll. And that's it. You expect that that's not going to be anymore. The lights come up in the theater and it's time to go home, and that is the end. And sometimes the world would have us believe that that's how life is too. You reach a point where it just, metaphorically speaking, the words go across the screen of our lives and says, "The end." Rather than the lights coming up, the lights just go down forever. And that's the end. Well, if we believed that, then as Jesus went to the cross, the story was over. Evil had won. Once Jesus' love had taken him to the cross, that seemed for many people like the end of the road. And if you can put yourself into the place of his disciples, those who had been closest to him, who had followed him for the past several years as he went about doing miracles and preaching and proclaiming the good news that the kingdom of God was at hand, you can imagine how they felt. A devastating mixture of sadness and confusion and fear as they wondered what they would do next on that difficult Sabbath that followed the cross. Was this the end? Had the messianic movement failed? If you read Luke 24, and you see the two disciples of Jesus who were traveling the road known as the road to Emmaus, and they're talking about these things that have happened and referring to the crucifixion. Jesus comes up alongside them, although they don't know that that's who it is. They don't recognize him, but they're talking about what's happened, and one of them says, "We had hoped that he was the one," which implies we thought he was, but I guess he's not. Was it the end? They certainly felt like it. Today, on Easter Sunday, we conclude this series by celebrating a love that never fails. A love that took Jesus not only to the cross, but carried him through the cross, all the way out the other side, declaring victory over the grave itself. So to understand that victory this morning, we're going to kind of come alongside one of Jesus' disciples named Mary Magdalene as she goes to the tomb and she discovers that it is empty. John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10 to start. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And so she ran and she went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, who we believe to be John, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple. They were going toward the tomb, and both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he didn't go in. And then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed, and for as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. So Mary, in the beginning of what we read here, Mary comes to the tomb, it says, before the sun came up. She comes, it says, to come to the tomb early while it was still dark. There is a darkness as she approaches the tomb. And the darkness here is more than physical, I think. John uses light and dark as he tells the story of Jesus to speak about the condition of the people that he's telling the story about. And so as she comes to the tomb in the dark, we can sense a lingering darkness that is over her of the pain and the confusion of the events that have happened. And you notice that her first thought on discovering that the tomb is empty, her first thought is not, "Hey, resurrection." Her first thought is, someone's taken the body. Maybe there was some grave robbers, or maybe the soldiers decided to play a trick on them and move him somewhere else, or we don't know what's happened. And so John and Peter, after she goes and she tells them this news, they race to the tomb, which is always kind of a little a joke among some people how John makes sure to tell us that he got there first, right? But they find this strange scene. Going into a tomb, and the cloths that Jesus was wrapped in are laying there, and the face cloth is folded. neatly folded and set apart from the rest. And that's a strange thing to consider. It's an orderly sight. It's not what you would expect if the tomb had just been ransacked looking for jewelry that a person might have been buried with or something like that. Grave robbers don't usually tidy up. And yet here we have this scene, and it is strange to find. And John tells us that just before he says that they didn't understand, before he says that, he said he saw and believed. He saw and believed. He didn't understand yet from the scriptures that this was what was going to happen, that this was how it had to unfold. That part he didn't understand, but he saw an empty tomb. And something triggered in him, and he believed something. And so we find in this moment, we find this as we're thinking about the love of Jesus that carried him to the cross. The love in action here is we see that Jesus shows us a love that is more powerful than death itself. A love more powerful than death. In astrophysics, there is, if you have heard of a black hole, there is something around the black hole that is called the event horizon. It's sort of the line where there is the point of no return. That if anything were approaching that spot, getting closer to that black hole, once it crosses the event horizon, there's no coming back, and nothing can escape going beyond that, not even light itself. It's got this intense gravity that doesn't let anything escape. In our experience in life, death has the same resume as the event horizon of a black hole. Once something crosses, nothing and no one escapes. Or so we thought. Peter says in his Pentecost sermon, which Grant read part of a little bit ago, and he says in Acts chapter 2, verse 24, referring to Jesus as God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death. Why? Because it was not possible for him to be held by it. Jesus crossed the event horizon and came back. It couldn't hold him. He could not be held by death. Why? There's probably several answers to that question. But death is fueled by sin. Sin brings about death, and Jesus had none. It could not hold him. Death is both empty and lifeless, but Jesus is fullness and the source of life himself. And so we find that the gravity of his love so exceeded the gravity of death that death broke. It didn't work. It couldn't hold. That's encouraging to me. I mean, death scares us. I mean, as humanity, death scares us almost as much as public speaking. But when we are filled with and we are fueled by the divine love that defeats death, then we can be fearless in the face of it. We can be emboldened to face it. It doesn't pose any threat to us. That's the life that Jesus wanted for us to experience, and that's why he chose the cross. He chose to go to the cross because he knew that that was the way to bring us into the life with him that he desired. He said in John chapter 10, verse 17, he said, I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I received from my Father. No one takes it from me. I am choosing to lay it down. I think it's just humbling to consider. Knowing who Jesus is, God in the flesh, out of the infinite options available to an all-powerful God, this is the path that he chose. Consider that for a moment. A God who can do anything he wants because he is God, this is the path that he chose. Why? As the Hebrew writer tells us, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. The joy set before him was that he opens the door to bring us in to be with him. It was out of his unfathomable love for you and for me and for all of his creation that he chose the cross. So he could do what no one else could. He could stare death in the face and take it down. That's our God. That's our Jesus, and that's the power of his love. Later on, when John gets his vision into the heavenly realm in the book that we call Revelation, he sees Jesus there. And this is what he sees. He says in Revelation 1:17, I saw him, and I fell at his feet as though dead. When he sees the glory of God, it shakes him to his core. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not. I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades. He went into the realm of the dead, and he took the keys. Death and the realm of the dead have been overcome, and they belong to him. Jesus shows us a love that is more powerful than death, which is staggering to consider, the power that is involved in that. And at the same time, the one with the power to reverse the irreversible is also near enough to see our tears. The greatness of his power does not make him distant. Let's go back to Mary. As she goes back to the tomb, verse 11, Mary stood outside. This is after, by the way, after John and Peter have looked inside, they've seen the cross, and then they've left to go back home. Mary stood outside weeping outside the tomb, and she wept. She stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet, and they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, they've taken away my Lord. I don't know where they've laid him. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing. But she didn't know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away. And Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. This has got to be one of my favorite moments in all of the Gospels, where Mary is there. She is devastated. Devastated. In fact, the word there that says that she is weeping has a connotation to it that it is somebody that is deeply sobbing with loud cries. She is in shambles at this tomb. She doesn't understand what has happened yet. And it's amazing to me that John tells us that she sees Jesus, and she assumes that he's the gardener, which is so poetic and beautiful that she thinks he's the gardener, because that's how God is described sometimes in the Old Testament. He is the gardener. He is the vine dresser. He is the one who created all things, who planted life itself and watched it grow, who planted a garden and called it Eden and then made humanity to tend it. He's the gardener. And so she's wrong, but she's also right. But here he's cultivating brand new life, cultivating new creation. Jesus has just achieved the greatest victory in human history. And yet he's there with Mary, He could have gone to the emperor and demonstrated, look, you tried to take me down, but here I am. He could have gone to the high priest and said, your trial, your sham of a trial didn't work. I defeated the grave. Instead, he takes time to minister to his distraught friend. And I think that's beautiful. Because God's love, even though it is cosmically powerful, it also remains deeply personal. His cosmic power is still deeply personal. How do you imagine that God sees you? When he looks, where is he looking from? And what does he see? Maybe we think of God's perspective kind of like satellite imagery on Google Earth or something, where he's just peering down from above and he sees all that's going on unfolding beneath him. And maybe there's some truth to that. He sees all things, and yet we see in Jesus, and especially in a moment like this, we see something different. We see a God who is not just peering down from above, but a God who is with us, who stands beside us as we weep, who cares for us, who is near enough to wipe away those tears, near enough to embrace and offer his support, and near enough emotionally. He knows our name. That's the moment that is so touching to me. As Mary thinks she's talking to a stranger at first, and somebody maybe that's done her and others wrong in removing the body, she thinks she's talking to a stranger, but as soon as he says her name, she recognizes this is no stranger. This is my teacher. This is Jesus. This is my Lord. Everything changes when Jesus says her name. And it reminds me of what Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 3, when he said, the sheep hear the shepherd's voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And I think that's exactly what he does with Mary right here. He calls her by name, and he's leading her out of that distress. This is our God. He knows your name too. He knows what's weighing on you. Even the thing that's weighing on your heart that you haven't been able to quite nail down why it's bothering you so much, he knows. What God has sought from the beginning is to be with us. He is a relational God, and his love has driven him to great lengths to open pathways throughout time to be as near to his people as possible. That's why they built the tabernacle and the temple, is to have God's presence among them. And God gave them this whole sacrificial system to make them clean enough to be in his presence, at least in proximity to his presence. And then Jesus comes. And Jesus brings his presence in a whole new way, where he becomes the ultimate sacrifice on that cross to open the way for us to dwell in his presence, and even more than that, for our very bodies to become the temple that his Spirit dwells within. God is much more than some set of doctrines that you need to study and make sure you get them all right. Doctrines are important, but our God is a relational God. He longs to be with you. He is the one who knows us and desires to be known by us. David wrote in Psalm 139, he said, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path, my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways." He goes on to say that, there's nowhere that he can go to get out of the presence of God, because everywhere he goes, he finds God is there. God is with him. And he even says that even before he was born, that God was there knitting him together in his mother's womb. And we can look at what David says and say, well, yeah, I mean, of course God knows him. That's David, right? He's a VIP of the Old Testament, right? He was one of the most important people in Israel's history. And that's true. But Jesus also proclaims, he points out that God notices even the cheap sparrows that are sold for 2 cents in the market. He knows them. You buy 3 of them, you get the 4th free. They're cheap. Nobody notices them, but God does. And Jesus says, you're much more valuable than the sparrows. And he says, in fact, he's numbered the hairs on your head, which is such a mundane thing, but it is to say that God knows the mundane things. He knows you. And so God looks at us, and he doesn't just see humanity in general. He sees you. When Mary realized that the King of the universe was standing right in front of her, that he was alive and well despite what they had all witnessed just days before, and that he was there, he was calling her by name, I think that darkness that hung over her lifted. And everything changed. And then she was overwhelmed with the joy. I think we ought to hear the joy of recognition as she proclaims Rabboni to him. She identifies who he is. That's her teacher that she loves, that she's respected, that she was distraught over losing, and he's back. And then Jesus says to her in verse 17, "Don't cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but instead go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." I always thought it was interesting that in this moment that Mary's so excited to see him, and you can imagine her holding on to his robe there, and he says, "Mary, don't cling to me." You wonder why. And people have developed a few answers to the question of why he says, "Don't cling to me." And I think that maybe there's several reasons, but part of it may be that she's thinking, I was upset that it was over, and now that I see he's back, we can go back to the way that things used to be. We can continue on with what it used to be, and I'm going to hold on to that now. Maybe Jesus says, "Mary, don't cling to me. We're not going back to the way things used to be. We're pressing forward. I'm not coming back to regain my old life. I'm bringing all of us into new creation. There's just one more thing I need to do. Got to ascend to my Father. I've got to take my place on the throne where I can rule once and for all and bring the hope of life to everyone who will receive it." Maybe there's something to that. Mary also has a mission that he's going to send her off on, and maybe he says, "Don't hold on to me. I've got a mission for you instead." We'll come to that in just a minute. But as we come to know the love of Christ, we can experience hope and renewed life. Once we see this love that is more powerful than death, that is so powerful to conquer death and yet so personal to be there in our lives to care for us. Once we see that and experience that, it gives us hope, it gives us renewed life. In the humid forests of the southeast, there's a plant that's known as the resurrection fern. It looks something like this. If you were to see this fern during the long summer drought, you might not even think it was a plant at all, because it's just this crusty, dried up husk of a plant. The rain stops, The ground dries up and the resurrection fern just completely shrivels into this tight gray ball. It's ashen, it's brittle. If you reach out and you touch one of those fronds with your fingers, it'll just snap off and turn into dust in your fingers. It looks utterly, hopelessly dead. And in fact, it can stay in that seemingly dead state for years. Botanists tell us that it can lose up to 97% of its water and stay in that dried up state for decades. To the casual observer, it is a lost cause. There's no life left in that plant. But as soon as the storm comes, as soon as the rains begin to fall, something miraculous starts to happen with the plant. The fern is transformed by that life-giving water, and within just a few hours, those tight, shriveled coils begin to unfurl. The gray begins to turn into a vibrant, lush green, and what looked like dead sticks becomes a sprawling, living carpet of life. It wasn't actually dead, it was just waiting for the right power to wake it up. Sometimes we can feel like that fern, just kind of dried up, uncertain, feeling hopeless perhaps. And maybe you came here this morning with some of that in your heart. Maybe there's a drought that's lasted for years. Maybe there's a tragedy, someone's betrayed you, or just the weight of mistakes piling up and leaving us feeling dry and brittle. But the resurrection is the promise that the living water has arrived, that when we encounter the love of Christ, when we are joined to him in his death and raised to walk in newness of life, his resurrection power hits that soil in our lives and begins to bring it back. He is the water, calling us to live again. Peter, who had raced to that tomb, who stood there and saw the cloths and nobody in the tomb. He later would say this in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you. A dead hope wishes that things were different, but is resigned to the powerlessness of the situation. Peter proclaims instead a living hope that has a confident expectation that is rooted in the reality of God's power that was shown in the resurrection. We have a living hope because Jesus lives. Paul said in Romans chapter 6, we were buried therefore with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. When we are baptized into him, his incredible story becomes ours too. Hear that. When we are baptized into his death and pulled up to new life out of those waters, we join our story with his. I've been crucified with Christ and I no longer live. It is Christ who lives in me. He gives us his resurrection power, bringing us newness, a newness that goes beyond just repairing what is broken, but gives us an unprecedented kind of life like we've never had before, which cannot be found from any other source. It means that we can trade all of our brokenness and trade our bitterness and trade our anxieties and trade our selfishness and get back newness of life that is defined by wholeness and grace and peace and unconditional love. It's a life of a different quality. Once Mary encountered this death-conquering, life-giving love, Jesus commissioned her with a message. He said to her to go back and tell the others. Tell the others that I'm going to ascend. And in verse 18, she does just that. Mary Magdalene went and she announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And that he had said these things to her. And see, I think that's another reason why Jesus says, don't cling to me. He's saying in this moment, there's more to do. Mary, I've got a mission for you. I need you to go and you need you to tell the disciples what's going on, that I am alive, that I'm here, and that I'm going to ascend to the Father. And so Mary becomes the one to go and proclaim this to them. Against all odds and against all cultural expectations, she becomes the first witness, the first proclaimer of the resurrection. It's a beautiful moment. And we see that, to wrap things up here, that a love of this magnitude, it must be shared. A love of this magnitude that conquers death, that is both cosmic and personal, that is bringing us hope and renewed life, this magnificent love has to be shared. It's too much to be contained and just to be held within ourselves, just for ourselves. Jesus gives her a message and she is faithful to share it. And I love, by the way, the simplicity of what she's quoted as saying. She goes and she says, I have seen the Lord. And it says that she tells them the rest of the story as well, but her message is, I have seen the Lord. And I'm reminded of several weeks ago when we talked about in John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman at the well, and she encounters Jesus, and then she goes back to her village and she tells them, hey, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. She just wants to share what she's experienced with everyone else, and Mary is doing something similar here. And I'll remind you of what I reminded you when we looked at that story. You don't need a theology degree or to be a polished public speaker to share the gospel. You just need an encounter with the King. There's a lot that we don't understand. There's a lot that we won't understand. And there's a lot that's hard to explain, but we don't have to know all of the hows if we just trust the who. We can go and we can tell people, I've seen the Lord. Later on, Peter and John would find themselves compelled to share the gospel as well. And they would go around telling everybody about Jesus, and no matter what anybody said to them to try to make them stop, they just wouldn't do it. They were threatened by people that had the power to threaten them, and Peter and John said this in Acts 4:19, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. We can't hold it in. This is so important. This is a magnitude of love that must be shared. When you've been changed by a love and a power like this, silence is just no longer an option. It flows naturally out from our renewed hearts. You can imagine being in a long and brutal war. And then when the peace treaty is signed, it's not kept secret. People go out and they shout from the rooftops, it's over, the war is over, we have peace. It's good news. The war of sin and death was won at that empty tomb. And we are messengers of that good news. To say that the war is over, death has been defeated, the King is alive. And we may have the opportunity to do that with our words. But even when we don't have the opportunity to do it with our words, we surely can do it as we put His love into action. As we've talked about over the last couple of months, as we live out lives of love that are uniquely godly, that is a unique godly love. As we put that into action, we are showing the world what He is like. We are proclaiming that He is here, that we have seen Him, that we've been transformed by Him. as we show up for our neighbor, as we break down barriers, as we serve others without trying to get credit for ourselves, but seeking to give Him all the glory. As we live out this love, our lives say what Mary said, I have seen the Lord. And so may we be filled with that powerful love. May its light overwhelm any darkness that lingers within us, and may it bring us new life in God's presence. And may that love flow out of us to a world that is ready to be renewed by a love that never fails. This morning, if you are ready to become a follower of Jesus, if you have not committed your life to Christ and you want to, we do that as we enter into the water of baptism. As I said, when we are baptized into Him, His story becomes ours. We have that story of dying to ourselves and living a resurrected life that is in eternity with Him. If you want to join yourself with Christ, we would love to baptize you today. In just a moment, we're going to sing an invitation song, and I'll be at the back of the room with the elders. And I invite you to come to us, and we'll talk to you about baptism. If you're ready to do it, we'll baptize you today. What a great thing to do on Easter Sunday. But if you need anything else at all, we're also there for that. If you want prayers or just somebody to talk to, we'll be there for you in the back of the room during the next song. Let's conclude with these famous words from John 3:16, and then we'll sing. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through Him. If we can help you this morning, would you please reach out as we stand and sing?